His innocent face has become a symbol of the dysfunction plaguing the State Department of Children and Families. 5-year-old Jeremiah Oliver, now presumed dead, was under the supervision of DCF when he went missing late last year. Oliver's case is getting a lot of attention right now, but as our partners at the New England Center for Investigative Reporting found, he's just one of nearly 100 children who have died under the state's watch. In this week's in-depth focus report, we're taking a closer look at the history of DCF cases falling through the cracks. In her Waltham kitchen, Andrea Rizzatano looks at pictures of her great-nephew, Caden Hancock.
He was a beautiful, sweet boy.
Back then, Andrea had known something was amiss with how her niece, Christina Hancock, was treating Caden.
Miss Hancock was very rough with the children. I noticed with Caden especially.
Andrea's growing alarm led her to contact the state's Department of Children and Families over a dozen times.
I became almost desperate to get help, and I called the social worker that was in charge of the case, and I begged and pleaded and cried for help. And it just didn't come.
DCF finally opened a file just before Caden was taken to the hospital with a broken arm.
And I then again intervened, and I said, please do not return him to the home. I will take him, give him to someone else, even a stranger, whoever you can, so that he'll be safe.
DCF did remove Caden from his home, but caseworkers returned him 1 week later, a decision Andrea protested.
They didn't feel they had to give me a reason, and that's what they said. The social worker would come occasionally, every few weeks, and she would see that the house was clean, which I was cleaning, and there was food in the refrigerator, which I supplied, and that was it.
2 months later, Caden died of blunt force trauma. His mother pled guilty to manslaughter and is now in prison. Caden is just one of 95 children to die while under DCF supervision over the past decade.
How are you going to ship a little boy to a place where you don't know about? You don't even know these people. You don't know who these people are.
4-year-old Dontel Jeffers was beaten to death in 2005 after a little more than a week in a new foster home. Rebecca Riley was given a fatal overdose of psychiatric drugs by her parents. And most recently, 5-year-old Jeremiah Oliver presumed dead, a case Governor Patrick suggested is not a reflection on the system.
There are going to be outliers from time to time, people who don't do what they're expected to do.
But Andrea Rizzatano doesn't believe that.
We can't minimize the scope of the problem anymore and say, well, it's an isolated case here and it's an isolated case there. 95 children are not an isolated case here and there. It's a red flag, it's a pattern.
Rizzatano is suing DCF for failing to protect her nephew. Her case was dismissed last week, but she's planning an appeal. My next guest detailed the troubled history of the Department of Children and Families in the Globe yesterday. Jennifer McKim is a reporter with the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, a partner of WGBH. Welcome back, Jennifer.
Hi.
This really is a horrible story. So you have discovered these 95 cases, but you say it's possible there are many, many more that we don't know about. How come?
Well, first of all, that is 95 cases of children who died of abuse and neglect, who had some connection with social services. But so there were many, many more kids who died of other reasons that also died within the system. But also, they only gave us information up to 2010, so there's still 3 more years. And we know there's many other cases, including the most recent sad case of Jeremiah.
So other cases of neglect, it's not homicide. Some of these were homicides, so they don't really pinpoint a death. So why can't they be classified the way these were?
Well, these include abuse and neglect. So this includes all these children, but also there's a serious undercount of children who die in the United States of America and also through DCF. So it's clear there's more, but also just the numbers say that they only were able to give us till 2010.
So you're trying to compare this to other states, and you were having a hard time doing so. How come?
Well, for the same thing, these numbers aren't taken very well. And it's one of the big problems in the United States is that we don't know as much as we should. There's actually a commission that was just created by the president that's going to look into this. And I talked to one of the commissioners who said one of the first things he's going to do next month when he meets with this group is talk about how to better look at these numbers, because it is important.
All right, Jennifer McKim, thanks for your report. Appreciate it. All right, so what can be done to protect children under state supervision? Jetta Bernier is the executive director of the Boston-based advocacy group Massachusetts Citizens for Children. Jetta, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Emily.
You hear about these cases, but then you think, my gosh, there are so many families caught up in the system. At any given time, I think it's like 3,600 families, and you don't know how many children in that. It's exponential. It could be 10,000 people. So is it shocking that this number of cases that something goes bad? I mean, I'm not defending the social workers, although I will if I have to, because I think some of them work very hard. But how can you intervene on every case to make sure this doesn't happen?
Well, I think it's important to know that across the country, Child Protective Services is under siege. They are under-resourced across the board. They're dealing with the most dysfunctional cases in our states. And so the system is never going to be perfect. We know that because back in the mid-'80s, our organization filed a class action suit on behalf of then the DSS. We were identified as the next friend of abused and neglected children by the court. We worked with DSS for 4 years in an out-of-court agreement, and we saw the improvements that they made. We saw training for foster parents. We saw a medical passport system for kids. We saw the establishment of an internal professional advisory committee to help DSS look at these tough cases and figure out how they could learn from them. We saw multidisciplinary teams develop in the system. So I think that from our perspective, we have a kind of an historic perspective here. We have seen incremental improvements over the years. The system is much better than it was before. Now, I'm not an apologist for the department. Any death of a child is too many. But we now have children's advocacy centers that bring together forensic interviews and DAs and law enforcement and medical people with CPS to help them solve these complicated cases of serious abuse and sexual abuse.
There's a perception on the part of the public, and we may or may not be right, that the DCF would really like to keep children in the families. That's why they put poor little Hayden Hancock back with his mother. But in the case of Dontel Jeffers, for instance, that kid was ripped away from his family and then murdered in a foster care situation. So can you say for certain that one situation is better than another?
Well, again, the department has had this dual mission to protect children, to keep them safe, but also to reunite families and provide family support. You know, there's a lot of gray in this system. There's no black or white way to do everything. They have to assess each case, as it's on its own merits. But I think that there is, beginning to be a little bit of a trend towards more child protection, particularly with these young infants, because most of the deaths related to child abuse and neglect occur in kids 3 and under. Deaths from abusive head trauma, shaken baby syndrome, almost any kind of blunt force trauma is going to involve very serious complications for the child. There's even some new discussions now going on in a few states where they have established what's called birth match, which means that every time a child is born, the vital statistics folks convey information to the CPS department to let them know, to see if there's a match. In other words, is there a child who is in foster care, or is there a mother whose rights have been who
has the same DNA?
That's correct. Whose rights were terminated, and is that mother now have a new baby on the scene? It's a way to alert the system that if a child is in foster care and the state doesn't feel comfortable having that child in the home, why would they feel comfortable having an infant in the home? They go out not to do an investigation, but an assessment. And then they try to understand through a conference with a number of professionals whether, in fact, it is safe. And they have to defend their decision that it is safe to put the child in the home. So the system is looking for new bells and whistles to figure out how we can make these kids safer.
One of the issues, and we've talked about it here on Greater Boston a number of times, is protecting the privacy of these families, which people understand, but there's absolutely no transparency in the Department of Children's Services. It's very much like the Corrections Department. It's under this cloak of secrecy because it involves sensitive matters involving families and children in this case. Is that a mistake?
Well, it's interesting. There's an organization out in the western part of our country that's called Child First, and they've done an assessment of all the states related specifically to this issue of transparency when there are cases that go badly. And Massachusetts, according to our laws, have rated C, even a D at one point. Now, the state of Maine had a rating of C and D, but in the past couple of years, they're now A and B. So I'm starting to wonder, what is it about our laws that we could perhaps consider changing that might make things more transparent so that reporters like you and advocates like me have a better understanding of what's going wrong. A reporter told me the other day, 80% of the cases are receiving home visits. And she said, isn't that terrible? And I said, well, I don't know. What about the other 20%? Were visits made at week 5? Were most of those cases because they knocked on the door 10 times and mom and dad weren't home? We don't know. And so luckily, though, we do have the Office of the Child Advocate. That's an improvement over previous years. And they hopefully are providing a good oversight.
All right, Jetta Bernier, thanks so much for your insights on this.